good afternoon, everyone, or good morning or good evening, depending on where you may be. I am Larry Diamond, Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution with Glenn Tiffert, who I believe you see on the screen. I co-chair the program on China's global sharp power. This is the last in our seminar series for this academic year, 2021-22. And we are very pleased to be co-sponsoring this final seminar of the academic year of our program with the Stanford Center on China's Economy and Institutions, and with its co-director, who is with us, Scott Rozelle. Today, we have a session on this extremely important new book that has just come out from Cambridge University Press, co-authored by our speaker today, Bradley Parks, Banking on Beijing, the Aims and Impacts of China's Overseas Development Program, which our speaker, Bradley Parks, with his many colleagues, has been studying for quite some time now. Brad Parks is the executive director of Aid Data, a remarkable institution at the College of William and Mary, which is his undergraduate alma mater. He leads a team of 35 program evaluators, policy analysts, and media and communications professionals who work with governments and international organizations to improve the ways in which overseas investments are targeted, monitored, and evaluated. He has quite a bit of experience in the development assistance sector. He was part of the initial team that set up the very creative and path-breaking Millennium Challenge Corporation of the United States aid effort, US government aid effort. He oversaw for 5 years, from 2005 to 2010, the MCC's annual country selection process, and was acting director of the MCC threshold programs. He has obtained a master's degree in development management and a PhD in international relations from the London School of Economics and Political Science. And I have no doubt that his alma mater was extremely pleased to lure him back to be the executive director of this extraordinary initiative, Aid Data, at the College of William and Mary. I think it's fair to say that there's nothing quite like it anywhere in the world, tracking in an independent, analytic, academic, and objective way the flows of development assistance around the world, and in this case, the structure, the impact, the intended and the unintended consequences of China's overseas development program. So with that, Brad, we turn to you. We look forward to your presentation, and then we'll turn to Glenn and Scott Rozelle to engage you a bit before we open it up to our audience.
All right, well, Larry and Glenn and Scott, thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to share some of the findings from our book. I'm gonna jump right in. So 15 years ago, just to kind of set the stage a bit, China was still a net recipient of international aid. It is now the single largest source of international development finance in the world. So this book is about understanding how and why this extraordinary transformation took place in the space of a generation. A lot of what we think we know about China's overseas lending and grant giving, it's actually based on opinion and conjecture, or research that doesn't rest on a particularly strong evidentiary foundation. And my co-authors and I on this book, we are dyed-in-the-wool empiricists. So what we wanted to do was sort of take the conventional wisdom or wisdoms about China's overseas development program and expose it to empirical scrutiny. So a lot of folks in Washington and London and Brussels, they assume that Beijing is using aid to prop up rogue regimes, or they're using debt to ensnare and subordinate foreign governments. So we wanted to put those assumptions to the test by measuring, does China allocate international aid and credit any differently than its Western peers and its competitors? Another article of faith in Western capitals is that China bankrolls white elephants. So the rap on Beijing is that in its zeal to help efficiently install the hardware of economic development, it prioritizes speed over quality, right? And so its development projects, it's also alleged, generate inferior economic returns. So we decided, okay, let's go and measure the economic impacts of Chinese development projects, and let's benchmark them against the economic impacts of development projects financed by OECD DAC donors and multilateral institutions. So up until this point, no one's really been able to systematically test these assumptions, primarily because of a lack of comprehensive and reliable data. And Beijing shrouds its overseas development program in secrecy. It doesn't voluntarily disclose information about its aid projects through international reporting systems, nor does it publish detailed information about its commercial lending activities. It also uses very stringent confidentiality requirements to shield its grant giving and its lending activities from public view. So first order goal of the book was to build a stronger evidentiary foundation for analysis on the aims and the impacts of China's overseas development program. And I should say the book is the result of a 10-year collaboration between a group of economists and political scientists based in Germany, Hong Kong, and the US. So my co-authors are Axel Dreher, Andreas Fuchs, Austin Strange, and Mike Tierney, and they're based at the University of Hong Kong, Heidelberg University, the University of Göttingen, and William & Mary. And when the five of us were initially trying to get a handle on the scale and the scope and the composition of China's overseas development program, we had the audacity to first go directly to the authorities in Beijing. And we asked them if they would be willing to share detailed and comprehensive information about their overseas lending program and their grant giving program. And I have to say, they were very polite, but they told us straight up that the information we were seeking was a state secret. And when we asked why they didn't want the world to know more about what they were funding overseas, one senior government official said to us, look, everybody who needs to know about our generosity already knows. So after that initial interaction, we started poking around to see what sources of information were already in the public domain. And to our surprise, we discovered there's actually a vast treasure trove of information about Chinese government-financed development projects hiding in plain sight. And so the problem is that this information is highly decentralized. It's spread across hundreds of thousands of sources in more than a dozen languages. So you can retrieve official data from the aid and debt information management systems of the recipient countries. You can even get unredacted Chinese grant agreements and loan contracts in government registers and gazettes. You can find tons of information on Chinese embassy websites and reports published by parliamentary oversight institutions in host countries. So 10 years ago, in the summer of 2012, my colleague, Austin Strange, he led this exercise with a team of research assistants at William & Mary to develop a new method of data collection that we call tracking underreported financial flows, or TUF for short. And that methodology involves basically standardizing and synthesizing all of these fragmented bits of information spread across thousands and thousands of sources. So then Axel and Mike and we worked with Austin to try to figure out, is this methodology sufficiently robust to generate comprehensive and detailed data for Chinese projects in just one region of the world, Africa. And we published our initial results in a 2013 working paper. And then the methodology went through years and years of peer review and refinement. We re-engineered the methodology to reduce its reliance on media sources and increase its reliance on official sources. And then we ended up using the methodology to track official sector financial flows from China, not just to Africa, but the entire developing world, every low income and middle income country in the world. So I'd also be remiss if I didn't acknowledge up front that this data collection exercise, it did require a small army. So it involved 150 research assistants at William & Mary and 10 full-time staff at AData over a decade. So were it not for their sweat equity, that book right there would not exist. So there's 5 authors, named authors on the book, but this was truly an all hands on deck effort. So just to kind of fast forward from 2012, when we started this data collection, to today, here's what we know as a result of the implementation of the methodology. China's overseas development program, it is vast. It consists of more than 13,400 projects across 165 countries worth at least $843 billion. The data set we've constructed, it covers all sectors, it covers all low income, lower middle income, and upper middle income countries in every major world region. It's also unique in that it captures any project that has benefited from a financial transfer or an in-kind transfer from any official sector institution in China. So the data set in total shows that there are 334 official sector donors and lenders in China. Okay, just to sort of double tap that for a moment, like we often think about, those of us who track the Belt and Road Initiative, we think China, oh, it's China Exim Bank and China Development Bank. No, the data set shows it's actually a broad constellation of actors. We're talking about central government agencies, regional and local government agencies, state-owned policy banks, state-owned commercial banks, state-owned funds. Even the country's central bank is in the overseas lending business. So there are other Chinese development finance data sets that are in the public domain, but they're all either sector specific or they're specific to a region or one small group of lenders. So this data set is unique in that it covers the full set of actors that are involved in overseas grant giving and lending activities. All right, so we make all of the data public. So when you're back at a computer, you can go to china.aiddata.org and you will find more than 13,000 individual web pages. Every one of those projects has its own web page that kind of tracks the project over its life cycle. We also publish all of the underlying sources that have been used to construct the data set. So you can go on our website, and you can now peer inside unredacted loan contracts and grant agreements and debt forgiveness agreements. You can even look at ex post forensic audits of these projects done by parliamentary oversight institutions in the host countries. What you're looking at here, this is a 2013 loan agreement between China Exim Bank and the Ecuadorian government. So this is one of 94,000 sources that we've put online, the sources that we use to construct the data. The methodology document the 90-page document is also online if you're interested in digging in. So here's what I'm going to try to do over the next 20 minutes. I'm going to try to answer these 4 questions. First, what is the nature, scale, and composition of PRC development finance? How does it compare to US and Western development finance? Second, why does Beijing provide aid and why does it provide credit? What are the kind of motivational factors that are behind its aid program and its lending program? Third, how effective are these projects? Who benefits the most and the least, and do they have any unintended impacts? And then finally, what are the key challenges that Beijing is likely going to need to confront in order to sustain the Belt and Road Initiative over time? So let's start with that first question. So China is now outspending the United States government on a more than 2-to-1 basis. In an average year during the Belt and Road era, China has spent about $85 billion on overseas development projects. So by comparison, the US spends less than half of that amount each year, about $37 billion. So it's important to understand how Beijing is outspending Washington. They're outspending Washington with debt rather than with aid. So for every $9 of debt that the PRC issues, they issue $1 of aid to low income and middle income countries. And when I use the term aid, I'm referring to official development assistance, or ODA, as defined by the OECD. And when I use the term debt, I'm using that as a shorthand term for semi-concessional and non-concessional loans and export credits, what the OECD defines as other official flows, or OOF. So that sort of differentiation between ODA and OOF is like a key common thread through all the chapters of the book. And we find that it's really important to separately analyze their aid program and their lending program because they have different motivations for providing these financial flows, and they have different heterogeneous effects on various outcomes. So if you look at the graph in the bottom right-hand corner of this slide, what you'll see is that Beijing has dramatically increased the size of its overseas lending program. It is now the largest official creditor in the world, larger than the World Bank, the IMF, and all Paris Club creditors combined. But its foreign aid program is relatively small. It has not experienced a major expansion over the last 2 decades. Its annual ODA budget fluctuates between about $5 to $8 billion a year. So that puts it on par with like a Northern European donor like Sweden. So huge lending program, relatively modest foreign aid program. what has happened with development finance from the US government? Again, look at that graph in the bottom right-hand corner. And what you see is the US government's gone in the exact opposite direction, right? So they've ratcheted down overseas lending to extremely low levels. More than 95% of US development finance is now provided via ODA, or aid in the strict sense of the term. So another key feature and unique feature of PRC development finance is this strong commercial focus. So Beijing is hunting for profitable revenue generating projects. And that's why a typical overseas loan from China has a 4.2% interest rate. Typical loan nowadays from an OECD-backed lender like Germany or France or Japan has a 1% interest rate. The other thing that we find is Beijing is differentiating itself from its peers and competitors by financing big ticket infrastructure projects that virtually no one else is willing to bankroll. So PRC financing for mega projects, which we define as projects supported by a loan with a face value of $500 million or more, those projects have tripled during the Belt and Road era. And many of these big ticket projects, they're being financed via syndicated loans, where 3 or 5 or 7 or 10 Chinese state-owned banks come in together and pool their funds to support a single project. And syndication is essentially a risk-sharing mechanism that makes it easier to take on these big projects. So just to kind of put this in perspective, the average face value of a syndicated loan from Chinese state-owned banks in our data set is worth $1.3 billion. If you just look at the 50 largest loans, Chinese loans in our data set, every single one of them is worth $2 billion or more. So these are, we're talking about huge projects that in most cases, the US and the EU and the World Bank are either not willing or not able to fund. The data set also shows that since the BRI was introduced in late 2013, the country's state-owned commercial banks, like Bank of China, ICBC, China Construction Bank, they're playing an increasingly important role. So their lending activities increased fivefold during the first 5 years of BRI implementation. So a lot of folks in the policy community, they kind of fixate on the lending activities of the policy banks, China Exim Bank and China Development Bank. And it's true, they did a lot of the heavy lifting in the run-up to BRI. But since BRI has been introduced, the state-owned commercial banks have become major players. Given that most of these projects are being financed with debt, China has intensified its use of loan repayment safeguards. Its go-to repayment safeguard is collateral. If you look at the 50 largest loans that Beijing has issued for overseas development projects, 40 of them are underpinned by a source of collateral that can be seized in the event of default. But contrary to the conventional wisdom, Chinese state-owned lenders, they rarely ask their borrowers for physical assets like seaports, airports, and electricity grids as sources of collateral. They're savvier than that. They prefer to collateralize on liquid assets. Typically, they will require that their borrowers maintain a minimum cash balance in an offshore lender-controlled bank account. That way, if the borrower falls behind on its repayments, the Chinese state-owned lender can simply debit funds from its bank account without having to deal with the hassle factor of going before a judge to seize or liquidate a physical asset. So now I want to talk a little bit about Beijing's motivations for providing aid and credit. So just descriptive statistics first. If you look at a list of the top 10 recipients of Chinese aid and the top 10 recipients of Chinese debt, something that immediately jumps out is that there's very little overlap between these lists. China's biggest borrowers are Russia and Venezuela and Angola. But those three countries and many of the other big borrowers are not big recipients of Chinese aid. Iraq, North Korea, and Cuba and Burma, they're among the biggest recipients of Chinese aid. And the reason why there's so little overlap between these lists is that China's trying to achieve a very different set of objectives with its dollar-denominated lending program and its RMB-denominated aid program. So one of the core arguments in the book is that if you want to understand Beijing's underlying motivations for bankrolling any given project, you really need to pin down the concessionality level of the underlying financial transfer before you do anything else. So if you look at the financial transfers that are arrayed on this spectrum, you've got grants and technical assistance and debt forgiveness on the far left-hand side. These financial transfers are 100% concessional, right? Then on the far right-hand side, you have loans that are priced on market terms, which have no grant element at all. They're completely non-concessional. So 90% of China's development finance portfolio is on the right-hand side of the spectrum, right? It's somewhere between the 0% hash mark and the 50% hash mark. So these are revenue-generating projects that are guided by the pursuit of profit rather than the pursuit of foreign policy advantage. The other 10% of their project portfolio, it falls on the left-hand side of the spectrum, somewhere between that 50% hash mark and the 100% hash mark. These projects are focused on cementing political alliances and winning foreign policy concessions from recipient countries. So the other thing to keep in mind is that Chinese aid projects, here I'm talking about projects that are underpinned by a highly concessional financial transfer, they are qualitatively different from the projects being financed with non-concessional and semi-concessional debt. So as a general rule, Chinese aid projects cater to the interests of governing elites in major urban centers. That's why so many Chinese government grants and interest-free loans, and the interest-free loans are almost as good as grants. They're ex post, almost all of them are forgiven. Those grants and interest-free loans, they are disproportionately focused on constructing presidential palaces and parliamentary complexes and museums and theaters and statues and convention centers, usually in the capital. So they're catering to the interests of governing elites. The audience is, the people who make foreign policy in other countries. The audience of the targeted beneficiaries are not ordinary people, right? This is also why Chinese aid is used to provide personal vehicles and security details to senior politicians in host countries, okay? So as you move from left to right on the financial concessionality spectrum, you start to see very different types of projects. So when Beijing issues loans and export credits that are not provided on concessional terms, that are priced at or near market rates, well, now you see projects like oil refineries and steel mills and toll roads that they expect will turn a profit and thus allow their borrowers to repay their debts. So in the interest of time, I'm not gonna go too deep on this slide, but here's what I will say about Beijing's motivations for providing aid and its motivations for issuing debt. First of all, the statistical evidence is very clear. The PRC uses aid to implement the One China policy. Countries that recognize Taiwan are automatically ineligible for PRC aid. Beijing also uses aid to buy votes in the UN General Assembly. If a country, take one region, take Africa, if an African country increases, the average African country, if it increases the alignment of its voting with China in the UN General Assembly by just 10%, we find that it can reasonably expect to increase the amount of Chinese aid that it receives by 86%, right? So these foreign policy considerations, they do not matter very much when the PRC finances projects with non-concessional or semi-concessional debt. Chinese state-owned lenders, think of them as yield maximizing surrogates of the government. They are scouring the globe for profitable projects. And it's this focus on commercial profitability that explains why Beijing's lending to developing countries is provided on substantially less generous terms. It's why the interest rates are at 4%, rather than 1%. They're trying to get a rate of return that is higher than what they can get by parking their excess dollars in US treasuries, which is what they did in large measure up until the 2008 financial crisis. It's also important to understand Beijing is using its overseas lending program to address three domestic challenges. Number one, an oversupply of foreign currency, specifically dollars. Number two, high levels of industrial overproduction. And number three, the need to secure natural resources that the country lacks in sufficient quantities at home. So to address these challenges, they've done three things. Number one, dramatically ramp up dollar-denominated lending at or near market rates, right? So the central bank signed entrust agreements with the state-owned banks. They entrusted their excess dollars and they said, go hunting. Go get me a better rate of return than what I can get through US treasuries. Number two, they are contractually obligating their overseas borrowers to source project inputs from China. And the inputs that they're contractually obligating them to buy are the things that are domestically oversupplied in China. So it's steel, it's iron, it's cement, it's glass, it's aluminum. If you're gonna build the standard gauge railway in Kenya, you're gonna do it with our steel. And then finally, the third part of the strategy is they're allowing countries to collateralize and repay loans with the money that they earn from natural resource exports to China. So when Belt and Road borrower countries agree to buy China's oversupplied project inputs, oversupplied industrial inputs, and they agree to absorb China's surplus dollars, what are they doing? They are effectively helping Beijing manage its domestic economic problems. Similarly, when they accept loans, by accepting loans that are collateralized against future natural resource export receipts, what are they doing? They're helping fuel economic growth in China. So Washington really likes to talk about Belt and Road as though it's some sort of grand strategy for building alliances and projecting influence and reshaping the international balance of power. And I often find myself trying to kind of temper that to say, guys, first and foremost, BRI is a strategy for managing structural economic problems inside China. Okay, so I'm gonna now talk a little bit about the impacts of these projects. So let's start, I'm gonna talk about this in terms of two measures of impact, efficacy and safety. Let's start with the efficacy. So the conventional wisdom is that China bankrolls politically expedient white elephant projects that deliver weak economic returns. And what we find in the book is the conventional wisdom is just wrong. So we find that Chinese government financed development projects have major impacts on economic growth in the countries and the subnational localities where they take place. So our statistical analysis reveals that the average Chinese development project increases a host country's economic growth rate by nearly 1 full percentage point, 2 years after the funding for the project is approved. So think about that. Those results imply that if a host country with a baseline economic growth rate of 2% chooses to accept 3 additional Chinese development projects, remember these projects are huge, they can reasonably expect to increase their economic growth rate to 4.85%. We also find that these economic impacts materialize very quickly within 2 to 5 years, and they're especially strong in one region of the world, and that is Africa. The most likely reason why the impacts materialize so quickly is because China implements brick and mortar infrastructure projects about 2.5 times faster than their peers and competitors. If you use satellite data, not to measure the national economic impacts, but the local economic impacts of Chinese development projects, you get very similar results. So you see major increases in local economic output within the districts and the provinces where the projects take place. And again, the economic impacts, when you go to subnational scales, the impacts are especially strong in Africa. Okay, so the other thing that we do in the book is that we not only look at the impacts on overall levels of economic activity, but how that economic activity is spread across geographic space. And what we find is that Chinese development projects aren't just good at increasing economic output, they're also spreading economic activity to more remote and disadvantaged areas. And how they're doing it is through connective infrastructure that help local residents and businesses reach more distant markets and places of employment. So we find that the implementation of one additional Chinese government-financed transportation infrastructure project, so a road, a railway, a bridge, a tunnel, generates a 10 percentage point reduction in the concentration of economic activity within the average district in our sample of low-income and middle-income countries. So pretty substantial. Just to kind of make this tangible for you, here's one project in our data set, okay? This is the Thica superhighway project in Kenya. I think it's a case in point. So this is a 50-kilometer expressway. It runs, if you look at the bottom left-hand corner, or kind of the southwestern quadrant, that is downtown Nairobi, right? So this is a 50-kilometer expressway that runs from downtown Nairobi to a set of satellite towns in peri-urban areas up there as you move northwest. So the rehabilitation of this road was co-financed by China Exim Bank and the African Development Bank. And if you take remotely sensed nighttime light output and you look at it along the road corridor before and after the completion of the project, what you see is that the biggest economic gains that resulted from the rehabilitation of the road, who did they accrue to? They did not accrue disproportionately to the residents of Nairobi. The biggest beneficiaries of this connective infrastructure were the households and firms living in satellite towns near the on-ramps. Those red lines are the on-ramps and off-ramps from the expressway, right? So biggest beneficiaries were the households and firms living in the satellite towns near the on-ramps and off-ramps along the linear path of the infrastructure. So who are these people? These are commuters, right? They're people who now it's easier to travel to and from Nairobi for work. So that's the good news. Now the bad news. The bad news is that while Chinese development projects are by multiple measures effective economically, they're not particularly safe, okay? So in the book, we provide evidence that Chinese development finance fuels corruption and political capture, it instigates violent conflict, it degrades the natural environment, and it creates debt sustainability challenges. So with respect to political capture and corruption, we find that there is rot in the system that China has created to fast track the approval and the implementation of development projects. So Beijing asks for loan applications from politicians rather than technocrats. And those politicians, they're usually in the office of the president or the prime minister in the host country, which is consequential because it means that many of the projects that get greenlit disproportionately benefit the core political supporters of guess who? The president and the prime minister. So the average political leader's home province sees a 52% increase in funding from the Chinese government. And that is when he or she is in power, but that political capture effect, it vanishes when the leader leaves power, right? So we also show in the book that in the run-up to elections, politically consequential jurisdictions for the political leader, they see sharp increases in Chinese government funding. Another finding from the book is that Chinese debt finance projects are especially vulnerable to corruption. So no bid commercial contracts are being issued to Chinese state-owned enterprises that already have a presence on the ground, and thus the ability to quickly mobilize as soon as a loan application is approved. So Chinese SOEs and the host country politicians who are responsible, quite literally, for submitting the loan applications, they have institutionalized a very simple but effective deception. So they first inflate the cost of the underlying commercial contract that the loan is going to finance. And then they develop a side agreement. And the side agreement is to split the extra profits, the rents, or the illicit proceeds from that commercial contract. That's why in a place like Sri Lanka, you see an unusual number of overpriced Chinese infrastructure projects that are all located in the president's home district, which also highlights one of the most important vulnerabilities in China's system for sort of rapidly implementing these big ticket infrastructure projects. So everything is hunky-dory unless or until the illicit financial relationships between the host country politicians and the Chinese contractors are exposed. When that rot in the system is revealed, could be by investigative journalists, could be civil society, it could be parliamentarians, doesn't really matter. And we're seeing this all over the world. These Chinese development projects that you might think of as reputational assets can very quickly become reputational liability. So in Sri Lanka, public antipathy towards China increased sharply when evidence emerged that the president was receiving illicit payments from a Chinese state-owned enterprise, and taxpayers were on the hook to repay loans for these highly overpriced projects in the president's home district, including one road that infamously cost $40 million per kilometer to build. So the point here is that the sources of rot in their system, they can sort of set in motion a domino effect or a chain of unintended consequences. In Sri Lanka, President Rajapaksa, the first President Rajapaksa, he was narrowly defeated in early 2015 by a political outsider. And that political outsiders, go and read his campaign manifesto. It called out the ruling party for exploiting Chinese development projects for private gain and for political gain. So another source of concern about big ticket Chinese development projects is their unintended environmental consequences. So what you're looking at on this slide is forest cover in Cambodia at baseline in 2000 and then at endline in 2019. The areas highlighted in red are the places that experience the highest levels of deforestation over that 20-year period. And over that 20-year period, Beijing financed 30 highway projects, either new construction or rehabilitation in Cambodia. So on the next slide, you can see the linear paths of the highways in the top right-hand side of the slide. So something that's immediately obvious when you look at the placement of these highways, is that they run right through protected areas where other foreign funders have deliberately avoided new road construction. So sure enough, we used quasi-experimental geospatial impact evaluation techniques. And what did we find? It's not correlation, it's causation. The PRC financed highways, they did in fact lead to major increases in deforestation. And a lot of that effect we think has to do with site selection, where they actually place the roads in really sensitive, kind of untouched forested areas. All right, I'm gonna try to land the plane here. Last issue is safety. I went through efficacy, now I'm going through all the different safety issues. Another one of the safety issues is debt sustainability. So the data that we have collected, it demonstrates that low-income and middle-income countries have substantially higher levels of public debt exposure to China than anyone previously understood. There are now 42 countries around the world with public debt exposure to China that exceeds 10% of their GDP. And roughly half of those public debts are hidden. So I want to just take a moment to explain what I mean by hidden. So prior to the introduction of the BRI in late 2013, most of China's overseas lending went to sovereigns, right? It was directed to central government institutions, ministries of finance, right? But since the BRI was introduced, China has redirected its lending, so much so that 70% of its overseas lending during the BRI era is directed to state-owned companies, state-owned banks, special purpose vehicles, joint ventures, even just private sector institutions. And these debts, for the most part, they do not appear on government balance sheets in host countries. However, most of them benefit from some implicit or explicit form of host government liability protection, which has really blurred the distinction between public debt and private debt. So even though central government institutions are not the signatories, they're not the primary borrowers responsible for repayment, they may, in many cases, be expected to step into the breach in the event that the primary borrowers go into default or become financially distressed. So just to make this tangible for you, the poster child for this problem right now is the Jakarta-Bandung high-speed railway, a $6 billion project. So it is being financed off the government of Indonesia's balance sheet with a huge amount of debt from China Development Bank, $4 billion of multiple loans, RMB and USD denominated loans. And when the project started in 2015, the president of Indonesia actually went and issued a presidential decree. And he promised taxpayers that not a single dollar would be used to support this, not a single taxpayer dollar would be used to support this public infrastructure project. Problem is, the project is running behind schedule and it's running over budget, $2 billion over budget. And so the railway is not generating revenue. So basically what happened was they set up an LLC, they set up a special purpose vehicle, it's essentially a shell company. That's the entity that's on the hook to repay the loan. Well, that shell company has no revenue and the grace periods have expired on the loans. So it's time to repay China Development Bank. And what we're finding is what was presented as private debt on the front end is now revealing itself ex post to be public debt. So just in October, Indonesian president issued a second decree and he said, hey guys, never mind, I'm authorizing a $275 million balloon payment from the public treasury to this special purpose vehicle. And he didn't acknowledge explicitly that that was going to be used to repay China Development Bank, but that's the only reason that the LLC was created, right? So that's the challenge that we're now facing. Much of the Chinese lending is now going to these types of entities where the nature of the host government liability protection is very opaque. Okay, so what sort of summary judgments can we make about Chinese development finance? I would say it's a lot more, first of all, it's a lot more effective than people realize, economically effective. It's also not particularly safe. In fact, I would say that that tension, that trade-off between safety and efficacy or risk and reward, it might be the most important thing to understand about China's overseas development program. So if you're kind of thinking about like, what does this mean for folks in the developing world and the developed world, I would say for leaders in the global south, the key takeaway is that the risks of relying on Beijing as a kind of financier of first resort, they're big and they need to be actively managed and mitigated. For folks in the global north, for leaders in the global north, I think the big takeaway is that if they want to effectively compete with China, they need to be really clear-eyed about the strengths and the weaknesses of their rival, right? So as a development partner, I would say the PRC's key strengths are scale, speed, and impact. At the same time, I would say Beijing is not 10 feet tall. Its Achilles heel is ineffective risk management. So it has very few safeguards in place to manage and mitigate the social and the environmental and the governance and the debt sustainability risks with this sprawling project portfolio all around the world. And what we're now, we're watching Beijing kind of learn this lesson in real time. So host country policymakers who were initially eager to jump on the BRI bandwagon, what are they doing now? They're increasingly suspending and canceling these high-profile Chinese infrastructure projects, because of concerns about corruption, about overpricing, contract overpricing, concerns about debt sustainability. So for the last 20 years, Beijing has tacitly encouraged countries to actually bypass the safeguard regime of their competitors, right? How are they doing that? They're fast-tracking these large-scale infrastructure projects with as little red tape or as little hassle factor as possible. And now, they're learning the speed and convenience that's baked into the system. It comes at a cost, right? And so right now, at least 35% of the BRI infrastructure project portfolio is plagued by major implementation problems, corruption scandals, labor violations, environmental hazards, public protests. So I think going forward, as Beijing tries to reboot and rebrand the BRI, that's what they're doing right now. They're in a period of introspection. They're going to reintroduce BRI in the next year or two. We're going to learn about what BRI 2.0 is. I think that they are going to be wrestling. They're already wrestling or ought to be wrestling with these 5 questions here. I don't think we're running short on time, so I don't think we're going to have time to go through all of them, but maybe during Q&A, we can
leave that slide up there.
Yeah.
Great, thank you so much. Glenn, we'll turn to you next.
Super, thank you. Brad, I am just humbled by the work that you've done here. It is extraordinary. And I hope you'll do much more of it too. In the interest of time, I want to focus on just 2 questions. You have experience having worked with the Millennium Challenge grants and in the Western aid and finance area. And so I want to put you in the hot spot for a second. As I think you've noted, you can have too much of a good thing. You can have too much efficacy and not enough safety, or you can have too much safety and perhaps not enough efficacy. One of the challenges, I think, is what lessons can we draw from where China gets it right? If you had a magic wand, what are a handful of things that you would recommend Western development finance, either governments or multilateral organizations, to do to improve their competitiveness with what China offers, but without compromising the safety? So that's question number 1. Question number 2 is, much of your analysis is premised on the 1.0 version of your data set, which goes up to, if I recall, 2014. And if you look at just the raw numbers that in your own slides, there were some important changes in the post-2014 to 2017 and 18 period. You have a postscript in the book that kind of gives a quick snapshot of that, but I'm wondering if you're willing to hypothesize on how the findings in the book about the period before 2014 either hold or change post-2014. Where are we right now? So those are the 2 questions. Thank you.
All right, great questions, Glenn. So I think the first question about kind of the Goldilocks problem of how much balancing efficacy and safety. I think what I would say is that the one inference that I would draw if I was back in my old US government role would be that it's extremely important for US development finance institutions to have the ability to listen to partner countries to understand areas of unmet need, like the nature of the demand, and they need the flexibility to adapt their programming to address those areas of unmet demand. So China has a demand-driven project selection system. They literally won't approve a project until they get a loan application and a project proposal from the host government. And most of the US government MCC aside, are kind of have it upside down, right? They start with their own ideas. They bring their own experts and say, we'd really love to do this health project or education project. We have these fancy consultants that already spec'd it out for you. And, here are 10 reasons why you should just accept this project, right? And so there's this decoupling between what's being provided and what the needs are. So I think China really stepped into the breach over the last 20 years in addressing unmet infrastructure financing needs, right? These countries have huge infrastructure financing needs, and most of the Western donors and multilateral institutions have actually gotten out of the hardware sectors of economic infrastructure. They've moved into health and education, governance, and humanitarian sectors. And so China's taken advantage of that. So I think number one would be, the US government needs to not be bound by legislative earmarks and, presidential initiatives and things that kind of tie the hands of the development finance institutions and prevent them from being able to, address those unmet needs that are otherwise going to be met by someone else, like Beijing. So I would say that's a big one. And I think that's one area where MCC has kind of got it right? So if you're for those of you who aren't familiar with MCC, if you have to meet these performance criteria, if you meet the eligibility criteria, then you, the host country, actually have to propose what projects you want. And so there's kind of rigorous economic analysis to vet the projects that are being proposed, but the projects are coming bottom up. They're not coming top down. The problem is MCC is a pittance. It's a small drop in the bucket. It's about $1 billion a year. US development finance is $37 billion a year, right? So we need more instruments, more programs that allow for that kind of responsiveness. A couple other things I would say. I think the US government and Western powers desperately need BRI, buyer's remorse, early detection indicators. And what I mean by this is there's about 24 countries where there's evidence of the countries that, or the leaders who initially jumped on the BRI bandwagon now saying, I'm having second thoughts. We've got debt sustainability problems, or public opinion has turned against China. It's harder politically for me to remain close with Beijing. And so in those cases, I think it's really important for the US government to not be caught, or Western powers in general, to have a rapid response capability, to be able to step into the breach. Because what we see is that these political windows of opportunity open. I told you about the Sri Lanka case, where there's a transition of power. There was probably 12 months or 18 months where the incoming administration in Sri Lanka was casting about for alternative suitors. They were like, look, we have no special affection for the PRC, but we do have a need for infrastructure finance. So who else is willing to play ball? And the answer was not many other actors were. And so what did they do? They went right back to China, right? So I think that being able to detect buyer's remorse at the early stages, because that window is only going to be open for a short period, is important. And then having that rapid response capability is huge. Last thing I'll say is we're transitioning from a period where Chinese lending was mostly about outflows out of China. Now for the next 3, 4, 5 years, we're going to learn that this is going to be about getting to know China as a debt collector. It's going to be about, most of the grace periods on these loans have expired. So now it's going to be about repayments, right? And so a lot of countries are about to encounter their hour of need, where they're going to have to go into high stakes reschedulings with China. And we've done some kind of deep dive research on these reschedulings. And one thing that we've learned is that you don't want to show up to a gunfight with a knife. And what I mean by that is, like, when you go into a rescheduling with China, let's say like Cameroon rescheduled 18 loans in mass with China Exim Bank, one of their biggest bilateral creditors. And one of the things that we routinely hear from sovereign borrowers is they don't see a lot of Chinese people at the reschedulings. They see top flight transaction lawyers from London and New York and Paris. So China spares no expense in these reschedulings, and they do the net present value calculations, the loans, and they're prepared to offer a basic deal. And the deal is, look, we have a boatload of dollars, so we're happy to provide liquidity relief. We'll extend your grace period, we'll lengthen the maturity. We might even provide, in some cases, they'll do bailout lending. They'll provide new loans to repay old loans. What they won't do is take a haircut, right? So in net present value terms, they want to be made whole, or in some cases, we found in Congo Brazzaville, they rescheduled $2 billion of debt with China. They came out in NPV terms, $300 million poorer. The borrower is $300 million poorer than if they just did nothing and just didn't reschedule, right? So, and who did they send to the rescheduling? They sent mid-level functionaries, right, to go head to head with, the best sovereign debt lawyers in the world. So I think that's an area where Western powers can help by, these fancy lawyers cost a lot on an hourly basis, but in the grand scheme of things, it's a pittance to be able to ensure that sovereign borrowers have the best legal representation possible when they go into these reschedulings. And Glenn, remind me your second question. I'm sorry, I got off on a tangent. Oh, the extrapolating of the findings.
That's right, but maybe you could just give us a quick capsule of that.
Very
and
quick
over to
word.
Scott.
Quick version is all the replication data are available, and we have all the code and data set up so that you could take the new data and rerun the same models. We've started doing that ourselves. We've only done it for the chapters that have to do with allocation, not on impact. And what we found is so far, the results that have to do with the motivations for providing aid and the motivations for providing credit, it's largely the same results. We don't see a lot of differences. We have not yet looked at all the various analyses that look at measures of impact, intended and unintended impact. So that's kind of a future research direction. And we really designed this to not just be a book, but it's a public good, right? We build a data set, we made all our code transparent. We want people to go and extend the code. And hopefully this will be the beginning of a long-term research agenda, not the end.
Okay, Scott?
Good. Given the time, I'm going to try to be really quick. So I'll just ask the basic questions, but I first wanted to say it's a fantastic set of data and analysis that you've done. Our group, like yours, data-based, that's what you look at, and you've done a great job. I don't know a lot about BRI. I've been out reading all week and getting ready for this, and there's 2 or 3 other empirical papers that just completely, you sort of provide the glue to put the whole picture together. A paper by George Caskey, he looked at how BRI investment actually makes autocrats more autocratic, but they also make democracies more democratic. And it's very interesting, but that's consistent with a new paper coming out from University of Hong Kong, or I guess it's from Science and Tech, which basically says, as in democratic countries, where, by the way, that's, or at least with competitive political institutions, that's where most of the investment's going to these countries, is the opposition uses this to pummel the party in power, and it creates this better democracy. And the public opinion goes like this. So, but you bring it all together. Three quick questions. Why should they even pay it back, these countries? I mean, you say sometimes they have a boatload of cash off. Most of these countries don't have a boatload of cash offshore in Chinese, I guess. I mean, that's what I'm saying. Why don't they do what Latin America did to us in the 1970s and 80s? They just said, we're not going to pay you back.
Default. Yeah.
We just default, right? And and
Tom Finger, your colleague, had a similar question.
you better, okay, got it. So that's number one. Number two, I don't understand, and I read it sort of over and over, trying to get up. I don't see you could have such big growth impacts if you also have increasing debt, increasing corruption, falling safety and negative impacts on the environment. I don't get how those two things, maybe locally. So I couldn't tell if that was local, but you said it's national impact on growth. The last one is, what do you think? So Ted Miguel, just from Berkeley, just gave a talk last week over here talking about aid. And it was really about unconditional versus conditional aid. And that China is the greatest unconditional aid giver, right? And he basically in his talk, where he has really recent data, shows that most of this rise of BRI is it's 2014, 2018. And he says, the rest of the world has now responded, right? And we're giving more, not enough, but giving more. That's what he said. He said, but China has almost come down to zero. They say, we're not, I don't know if it's they're waiting to collect or if it's because of their falling economy, their all their COVID problems, the refocus. Is that because they think they've already succeeded and they're gonna reap all this money back? Did they figure that there's no use, that we could get this elsewhere, or they don't think they're going to get paid back, or there's just no money in China? And so those are my.
And just to add one tweak,
yes.
I drew the inference from what you said, which may be unfair, that the economic growth positive effect is a short-term, almost sugar high, as this money is pumped in, and these effects have an immediate stimulus, but then reality catches up because of all the perversities. Anyway, over to you.
And I omitted an important empirical fact, and that is when you look at that sort of time path of the impacts, they materialize in year 2 of the project, they vanish by year 5. They're gone after year 5. So that is consistent with the argument that you're making, Larry. I think just because of the length of the time series, we don't yet know about the long run economic impact. So everything that we measure are short run economic impacts, right? So like these projects, these public investment projects, right? They generate costs and benefits over 20 years, 30 years, right? And so we're not fully accounting for all of those costs, like the environmental costs, right, or the cost of the on the debt side,
corruption,
exactly.
authoritarianism,
yes.
environment, instability.
Yes. So it's a big, very important caveat on the economic impact estimates. Couple responses to these great questions. One, why should they pay it back? Couple reasons. One, it's an iterated game, right? So like if you don't repay, you are jeopardizing your ability to continue to borrow from the single largest infrastructure financier in the world. So there's that. There's also the issue of debt seniority, right? So China is unique in that when they issue, like after World War II, most official creditors, bilateral and multilateral, said, look, we're not going to collateralize loans to the developing world because it complicates debt restructuring, right? And so we're going to sort of put down our arms. We're not going to have a collateral arms race. Well, China wasn't part of the Paris Club. They weren't socialized to those international norms. So when they come on the scene, domestically, they collateralize a lot of their lendings. So they're like, we'll just keep doing what we've been doing domestically, we'll do it internationally. Well, what that has done practically is it's put China at the front of the repayment line among official creditors. Because if you think about a situation of debt distress, where you're a borrower in distress, you don't have enough money to repay everyone, who are you going to repay first, right? You're going to repay the lenders who have the most leverage over you. So typically, like the way that China is asking for this collateral, it's usually they calculate they take 1 year's worth of principal, interest, and fees on a loan, and you, the borrower, have to keep that amount in an offshore lender-controlled bank account. So for example, Uganda took a $200 million loan for the Entebbe Airport Rehabilitation Project. The borrower has to keep $17 million in hard currency in a lender-controlled bank account. right? And so none of the other official creditors are asking for that. So if Uganda goes into debt distress, what are they going to do? They're going to line up their creditors from tallest to smallest, and they're going to say, I'm going to repay the guy who can literally just take this grab and go asset, this $17 million in cash without ever donning the doorstep of a courtroom, right? You don't have to, the bank has set off rights. It does not have to go to court to recover that money. They just, the set off rights allow them to just literally debit the bank account, right? So borrowers make decisions in light of that reality. And then finally, you asked this question about, okay, the decline in Chinese lending. First, I'll just say, just so I'm on the record on this, I don't believe the conventional wisdom about the lending vanishing, right? So this, I don't know if you picked up on this, but I said early on, something unique about this data set is it captures 334 official donors and creditors. It is true that lending from the two policy banks, China Development Bank and China Exim Bank, has absolutely plummeted. What I think a lot of people are failing to understand is that we are now moving into a new phase of lending where it's not project lending, we're going into rescue lending mode. So what our data set shows now is that PBOC is going into overdrive. It's now doing emergency loans. These are through currency swap drawdowns or through liquidity support facilities. We're talking about tens and tens of billions of dollars, short maturities, very short maturities, high interest rates, and they're explicitly authorizing borrowers to use the proceeds of the emergency loans to repay old project debts. So what's going on is that they're making a bet. They're saying it's a liquidity problem, it's not a solvency problem. If I keep my borrowers sufficiently liquid, they'll sort of weather the storm and then, you know, we'll come out whole on the back end. I think what we're seeing in Sri Lanka and elsewhere is that it might not be a liquidity problem. It might actually be a solvency problem.
Okay, we're going to go a little bit over, but we still, even with that, have only about 10 more minutes. So let's keep the questions and answers short. We have a couple Hoover fellows, well, 3 now. Aaron Carter, who is a specialist on China's foreign policy and international behavior. Aaron Baggett Carter. Brett Carter, who studies the African countries that you are noting have been the recipients of this generous behavior, including Congo, Brazzaville. You mentioned Matt Lowenstein, who's a historian of China and the Republican era and elsewhere. I've got one question here I've just got to read. So let's go to each of you. Start with you, Aaron, and keep them very short.
Fantastic. Thank you. I just want to start my question by saying this is a truly impressive project. You've done an incredible job here. I mean, the incentives are not for spending a decade gathering data. I really applaud the important thing that you've done here. So with that in mind, I'm curious. How, if you can give scholars on the call in the room a sense for how do we study this public good that you provided, what data do you feel that you're missing, right? A lot of loans, a lot of these financial vehicles are confidential. When you do this data analysis, what do you feel is more or less reliable? Can you give us a sense of the data generating process, and in particular how you think about what direction that may bias any of the findings in your book, if at all? That would be really helpful to know how you think about that problem in this enormous and impressive data collection project. I have a few other things you can just pick if you want to address them or not. So I also am curious, so Kara Wise has a book on Chinese lending and aid in Latin America, and her real argument is that the effective really differs by the regime type of the host country, right? Democracies with good regulatory apparatuses are able to channel this investment to productive ends. Autocracies aren't. Did you break out the analysis in that way, and what can you tell us about that? And finally, I mean, this is the amazing picture you've described is not an equilibrium, right? You see Chinese lending increasing, but I mean, Louisa Lim has that amazing study of journalists across the developing world and what they think about Chinese aid and investment. Publics and journalists and leaders are getting more skeptical over time. So where, if you look out 5 or 10 years in the future with Chinese lending, you mentioned, becoming a debt collector, where do you see this relationship heading?
So quickly, just disbursements and repayments are a weak spot, and it's a problem. We're not done with data collection. This will be a long run initiative. We capture loan commitments, right? And where this thing is heading, it's about the reflows, right? So we're going to be moving in that direction. The other area is on emergency lending. They're going, I mean, no one really has this nailed, but it's very clear they're moving into an IMF role. I don't think it's an equilibrium. I mean, we're seeing in Sri Lanka, they're almost schizophrenic about whether they want to be the lender of last resort or they want the IMF. I think, it's unclear, but yeah, disbursements and repayments, it's a known weakness. It's one that we're committed to fixing. One area that was a weakness, but it has improved dramatically, is on the spatiotemporal rollout of project implementation. So what we found was there were hundreds of studies leveraging earlier iterations of the data set, and what academic users of the data set said is, look, to get clean causal identification, we need to measure with precise geographic detail what are the kind of footprints of the projects and when does treatment turn on and off, right? So we're now tracking project implementation start dates and conclusion dates down to the calendar day, so that you can more easily get inferential leverage when you've got an outcome measure that has an equal level of kind of spatial and temporal measurement precision. The other thing I would say is like known weakness, or something that like keeps me up at night, is lending to special purpose vehicles that are domiciled offshore. So, I mean, if you look at like what happened in Sierra Leone, the single largest loan ever contracted, single largest public debt ever contracted by the Sierra Leonean government was to a special purpose vehicle with an opaque sovereign guarantee that was issued. The borrowing institution was registered in the British Virgin Islands, right? So it never showed up in any of the public debt registries, like our go-to sources, right, for assembling the projects. We ended up uncovering that, but it was through a lot of like shoe leather, right? And so that is a concern, because now there's not the demand from sovereigns that there used to be, and they're shifting towards lending to more and more SPVs for public-private partnerships, right? So that is going to make our lives more challenging, right? To make sure that we're not missing a lot of loans that are happening in the host country, but legally the borrower, the financial flows are going to Jersey, to British Virgin Islands, to the Cayman Islands. We already know that's going on all over the place. So we're going to have to adapt our methodology to follow the money.
Okay, Brett.
Yeah, as everyone else has said, this is such a tremendously impressive project. I already have the book. I bought it, I think, on pre-order. I'm excited to really get through it. So congratulations, really. So I'm, as Larry said, I'm finishing a book in which Denise Assungesso is a key player. As it turns out, so anyway, that's kind of the wind up. You mentioned, taking a haircut, right? I mean, anyone who knows Denise Assungesso's sort of economic mismanagement over the course of the past 4 or 5 decades, like, knows that China's going to have to take a haircut, even if they haven't already, right? And so kind of the question, right, is what happens whenever lots of governments are in a position that are to sort of like require the Chinese government to take that haircut, right? So I was going through some data for the book that I'm finishing. It turns out that something like the average debt to GDP ratio across all of Africa's autocracies is now about like 70% or so, right? Which suggests that this haircut is going to happen pretty soon. So I'm kind of curious, what happens whenever the tables get turned, right? So you mentioned that China has seniority, 17 million over 200 million. Not really that much, right? So I guess kind of what happens when kind of the tables get turned. Lots of countries are kind of forcing the haircut down kind of the CCP's forcing on the CCP, and then kind of conditional on the fact, as you said, that the CCP's lending is driven by foreign policy and domestic economic interests, right? Like to what extent, insofar as that haircut is probably inevitable, right? What happens in that case, like both on the CCP side, right? Which obviously sort of, has its sort of own political and economic concerns, but also then on, indebted government sides.
Oh my gosh, it's a great question. It's hard to answer concisely. I think what I'll say is we've not reached equilibrium.
Yeah.
Like they are trying to figure this. They're at the very early stages of trying to like understand their true preferences. I mean, their sort of initial
exposure, I would imagine.
Yeah, their initial position is like, we don't do coordinated reschedulings. We will reschedule bilaterally and discreetly, and we're not going to take a haircut. Full stop. But I think what we're seeing in Ethiopia, in Zambia, we should be watching Zambia very closely, and now Sri Lanka, is that they are going to have to figure out, is this going to be a repeat of the 1980s sovereign debt crisis? It very well could be the case that like we do Band-Aid solutions for a while. We do grace period extensions, maturity extensions, you do the emergency lending, and at some point you come to grips with the fact that it's a solvency problem. You say, I have to take a haircut, right? But we might be 10 years into it, before they come to that realization. I think we are watching them get socialized to international norms around debt rescheduling in real time. And it's very painful to watch. Like the Ministry of Finance in China, I think is like, they're kind of constantly iteratively recalculating like what they want to do here, right? So they kind of take a step forward, they take 2 steps back. They say, we're not gonna go into a coordinated rescheduling. Then they say, never mind, maybe we'll try this. And so I just think that it's gonna take there's going to be a learning process, right? They're making an initial foray into coordinated rescheduling. I don't know that this is probably online. One thing I will say is we had a study that came out a year ago called How China Lends, where we looked at 100 unredacted Chinese loan contracts. One of the big takeaways from that was that they include explicit prohibitions against rescheduling through the Paris Club. Well, we're continuing to, just through our normal data collection, collect these unredacted loan contracts. We have like 65 more than the 100 that we used to have. And so we've been able to look at more recent loan contracts, and lo and behold, the no Paris Club rescheduling clause has vanished. So I see that as an encouraging sign that they realize like that's a fundamentally unenforceable clause, right? It's more, they use that more for signaling purposes than for legal enforcement purposes. But the mere fact that the lawyers have removed it from the loan contracts suggests they are updating, right? And learning.
Okay, Matt, can you state it very briefly?
Very quickly. So for echo everybody's effusive praise of the project, you said that 2 years out these projects tend to increase GDP. Do you know if instead of looking at GDP, if we look at the project's ability to repay its cost of capital out of cash flow, then what kind of economic outcomes are we looking at? Become profitable.
Don't know.
Okay.
Wonderful project. I mean, like, I really hope that this will be the departure point for like lots of PhDs and various, I mean, I would love to pursue that with someone. If anyone's interested in pursuing that project, I'm interested, I'm game, right? But yeah, it's the right question. I don't know. I do know that there are a hell of a lot of projects that are now running over budget and over cost, and that are, struggling to stick to the original repayment schedule.
Even though we're out of the extended time, I cannot resist asking this question.
Okay.
You get about 60 seconds to answer it. This is
Lightning
from
round.
Jennifer Nordquist, Stanford alum, who's the most recent, before the present, executive director for the US at the World Bank. Everything you said here are points that is, she, Jennifer Nordquist, raised to no avail, that every project the World Bank turns down, China funds, and they then spread their corruption locally, environmental degradation, et cetera, not to mention sexual abuse of workers, et cetera. And the projects take too long and have too much red tape, which is why countries go to China. So my question is, other than learning the lessons the hard way, what should the US, the World Bank, and so on do to try and get Africa and other countries to turn away from these options?
Oof. I guess I don't know if I accept the premise of the question. I think that China's here to stay, and they're going to remain a major financier of international development. And we're in a unique moment in history where they are in a introspective mode. They are actively contemplating the possibility of multilateralizing BRI. They know these projects are swimming in risk, and they want to sort of recalibrate. So they're now sending signals saying, look, we're interested in co-financing projects. We're interested in using the due diligence procedures of the World Bank and the regional development banks. I think that creates a great opportunity. I mean, I showed you that Thica superhighway project. That was co-financed with the African Development Bank. The project actually did quite well, right? And although it was co-financed, it was with two different institutions, a common set of due diligence standards were applied to that project. And they were mostly the standards of the African Development Bank, right? And so I think that that's where I think there's more scope for reform.
Okay, great. The book is Banking on Beijing, the Aims and Impacts of China's Overseas Development Program. And the great speaker you've been listening to and co-author is Brad Parks. Join me again in thanking you.